I guess before you show the clip, let's just say, like, usually when I use this combination of words, it's ironic, like friend of the show, Ben Shapiro, shit like that. But non-ironically, right? The person about to criticize is a friend of the show. He's been on the show, and
a hero, and should be a hero to the left. I mean, like the things that he's accomplished are really amazing.
Well, I mean, one of them just came to fruition literally today, which is that in large part due to the investigative journalism, that he did, the leaks that he took serious risks to report in Brazil.
Yeah.
Lula da Silva just had, all of that stuff was voided. His political rights have been restored. He's now clear to run again in 2022. He would have won, the Brazilian election. The last time if he'd been allowed to run, and that is to a great extent, because of Glenn Greenwald, because of that reporting in Brazil, the Snowden leaks. I mean, this is somebody who has really just in human terms and in terms of political things that should matter to the left is worth any 500 of the people in media who sort of snipe at him and all that stuff.
He's worth more than the full lineup of MSNBC.
Yeah, exactly. Now, that said, right? I like Glenn. I deeply admire Glenn. One of the first conversations I ever had with Michael Brooks was about how much we both admire Glenn Greenwald. That's not going to change because of any sort of what show he goes on or any takes that he has on social media that I disagree with. But I also think that not for the sake of piling on or anything like that, but because the actual substance of what's being talked about is important, I do want to talk about this comment he made in this Daily Caller conversation about socialism because I think this matters. So you want to show?
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe your husband is affiliated with the Socialism and Liberty Party. That's correct, right?
Sorry about that. Yeah, that's exactly correct.
Okay. No, I just want to double check before I ask this. So why do you think the idea of socialism, both as it's framed by the right and the left in America, varies so drastically from what we've seen in, Brazil, other Latin American countries, even countries in Europe? Is that just because of, the huge play that identity politics has in America? I'm curious about that distinction and how it's evolved into something that doesn't really look like socialism anywhere else in the world, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, in Brazil, for instance, the Workers' Party was founded by Lula. He grew up in extreme poverty. He was, I think, the 8th of 9 children. He was illiterate until the age of 10. He went to work in a factory, famously lost one of his fingers, became a very charismatic labor leader, and ran for president 3 times and almost won more or less each of the 3 times, but didn't. And then the 4th time he ran in 2002, he realized, if I want to get elite sectors of society not completely against me, but even kind of comfortable, I need to moderate my economic policy. And so he ran as his vice presidential running mate with a banker, an actual, austerity advocating banker, just to calm international markets and make people less concerned about what his presidency would look like. And when he got into power, people were petrified that he was going to become like Cuba or Venezuela. He was a supporter of Chavez and Castro, but he always said, my form of leftism is not the one that erodes civil liberties. It's not communism. I believe that there should be a free market. We need that to generate growth. I just believe in a more equitable distribution of resources. And he innovated these social programs that even, kind of like think tanks, capitalist think tanks, and journals like The Economist to this day praise, including one where women who are single mothers who are raising children get a monthly payment as long as they can demonstrate that their children have been vaccinated and are regularly going to school. So it incentivizes them to make sure their children aren't lost into the society, are doing the things that make them healthy and educated, and only then do they get this payment. And Brazilian growth skyrocketed under Lula. The rich did very well and got very comfortable with him, which is why he overwhelmingly got elected. I think that's what you're seeing. I mean, obviously the word socialist carries a lot of baggage from the Cold War. It evokes on purpose the Soviet Union or, Castro or Chavez, Pol Pot, people like that, kind of the Mao. But I think what you're seeing is this kind of hybrid socialism that really is about nothing more than trying to sandpaper the edges off of neoliberalism. And I, would describe a lot of people on the right as being socialists. I would consider Steve Bannon to be a socialist. I would consider the 2016 iteration of Donald Trump, the candidate, to be a socialist based on what he was saying. I consider Tucker Carlson to be a socialist. Now if you have Governor Cuomo who wants to give, tens of millions of dollars to Amazon to bring an office to New York, you have AOC, an actual self-identified socialist, standing up and saying, this is outrageous. And then you have Tucker Carlson going on his Fox News program and saying, I agree with her completely, because I think people are realizing that neoliberalism doesn't work. And I think the real right-left difference, to the extent that those terms even have any currency or coherence, I think you see in France too, like Marine Le Pen, the fascist far-right candidate, when she ran both times, she ran to the left of Macron for sure, but even the French socialists, in terms of wanting to give workers better benefits and better pensions. So I think the vision is, you have this kind of right-wing populism, which really is socialism, that says we should close our borders, not allow unconstrained immigration, and then take better care of our own working class people, and not allow this kind of transnational global corporatist elite to take everything for themselves under the guise of neoliberalism. We should distribute that more to workers, which is basically what Bernie Sanders was saying,
right?
10 years ago. The left in America, in the United States, was always anti-immigration. When I started writing about politics.
All right. That's good. That's fine.
Tough to watch a little bit at some point.
Yeah. So look, I mean, a couple things about that, like this. So the first one is, and I do think this is true, right? Like, this is not just the fact that, like, obviously for all the reasons that we talked about earlier, and the fact that he was like, really like one of the main 2 or 3 people who were like still banging on about about wars and civil liberties, during the Obama years, when liberals had collective amnesia about this. And obviously I like Glenn, I admire Glenn, but like, I think even apart from that, before we get to all the things that I think are wrong, right, in this clip, which is, I mean, cards on the table, I think, is pretty much everything, in this clip. But I think that what is true is that 99% of people were who had a reaction to this were reacting to the Daily Caller social media managers like 6-word, clickbaity headline.
Yeah, and watching through the full answer to clip it for this, what kind of softened the way I felt about what he was saying, I guess.
Yeah, well, because I think that it is clear in context, and again, I think what he was actually saying is still wrong, right? I'm going to get to that in a moment, but but I think when people sort of saw the headline, Glenn Greenwald says Tucker Carlson is a socialist, they had the obvious, reaction to that. But I think that in the clip, he does actually say, look, this is not really historically, what socialism means, but in American politics, often there's this sort of watered down definition, which is really about sanding off the, the harsh edges of neoliberalism. And so far, like, that's something that, like, any, like, just think of any like ultra left account you might follow on Twitter.
Yeah, yeah. It's the post left, the post left idea kind of that.
Well, but I mean, I think so far, I mean, this is just like, I mean, look, like what I just summarized, like Jamie Peck could have said that, right? Like that's not like.
I guess I'm jumping ahead with that.
Yeah,
kind of joke,
yeah,
but.
I think the thing you're reacting to is a little bit different, although I think that's also there. Where I think it goes off the rails, well, okay, so I think he gets something important wrong, but it's not really where he goes off the rails, and then he goes off the rails, right? The important thing I think he gets wrong, and to be fair, a lot of people get this wrong, right, is that, look, let's not actually accept that semantic drift. You're right that sometimes this is, it is used that way. But it is like socialism actually means something, and that word is worth fighting for. I mean, like
I remember when it used to mean something.
Yeah, damn it. But also I think that there is, that I think that, like, if anything, I mean, look, I'm generally not one to get hung up on semantics. I think that arguments about how to use words are almost always proxies for other more interesting arguments. But also in this case, like, we are actually at a time when there is like a real socialist left in the United States for the first time in a very, very long time, a very small fledgling one, and it is worth making the distinction and saying, no, this doesn't just mean standing off the edges of neoliberalism.
And sometimes a confused one that doesn't quite grasp terminology. So I think that makes it doubly important to be precise about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of people who think of themselves as socialists are imprecise about the terminology, and they just sort of mean, well, I sort of vaguely associate this word with wanting the United States to have more programs like a country like Sweden, exactly, like Sweden has, or they sort of know that it's a word that has some connotation about questioning the current economic realities in a very basic way, and they like that and they respond to that, but they certainly don't have any conception of, like, we should have workers control the means of production. And that's fine. I'm willing to work with that, right? I think that's a good starting place. It's obviously not where I want them to end, but I mean, I think it's a fine place to start.
Yeah.
And I'll take it, right? And then try to build on it.
Fucking better than what we have right now. So
yeah, totally, right. and I think when people start fighting for those things, again, rather than fighting about words, maybe they can get to the point where they'll be willing to go beyond that, or they'll see more of an important distinction between exactly. I think that, like, a lot of what a lot of people mean by socialism is really just social democracy. They don't have a conception of a kind of socialism that comes after capitalism, and that's a big problem. And, like, honestly, I think this is kind of the higher order version of what we were talking about earlier about how so many people don't think that they can get like they just on a really basic visceral level don't believe that politics can make their lives better, because of this sort of bone deep capitalist realism. They don't believe that there's anything that would happen to change basic economic realities, because all of their experience of politics tells them that, well, maybe politicians will say things that make it sound like they're going to make their lives better, but really, the 1% calls the shots, and that's just how it's going to be. And it's like complaining about the weather. They're just giving, right? Like, there aren't any riots in the streets about not having Medicare for all because people don't take it seriously the way that they take it.
And I think in a lot of people's cases, they see politics as just what politicians decide to do, and not as the pressure that, collectively workers can put on the situation they're in, collectively, what they can put on bosses, what they can put on politicians, what they, you know what I mean? Like, it's something kind of disconnected through a phone going on in the city that they've never been to.
No, totally. So, and then, yeah, absolutely. And so I think that there is, like, a higher order version of that, which is, so, like, right now we're just talking about, like, regular people who might tell a pollster that they like the idea of Medicare for all. But, like, then I think even when you get into the actual left, people to the left of liberalism, people who would be like hardcore Bernie people who might even read Jacobin or, watch shows like this one's in some cases, right? That, like, I think a lot of those people, they maybe like the sound of socialism, but they don't really take seriously the idea that there is something that's possible that comes after capitalism.
Yeah.
Because, even if they've gotten to the point where they take the idea that we could really have social democracy seriously, they haven't made that other adjustment. And so
it's hard. It's hard to make that adjustment. You know what I mean? Like,
it's absolutely hard to make it. I mean, like, this is something that I think the left needs to really spend time on. This is actually one reason why, I think that we need to, that we need to sort of leave behind the, Karl Marx thing about not writing recipes for the cook shops of the future. I think we need to show people some recipes just so they believe that they'll have something to eat at the other end.
Yeah.
And give people a detailed idea of what that kind of society might look like. So none of this is the main problem with this clip, but I think it is worth saying because it's important. The main problem with this clip is that it's just not true that Tucker Carlson or Steve Bannon, any of these figures that he named actually in any remotely meaningful sense.
I read that in the Zizek voice. My God, we need the recipes now.
All right, well, Verso in 2022. Get that from me and Bhaskar and Mike Beggs. I mean, look, and obviously not that our forthcoming recipe is the only one out there. I'm not too familiar with Varoufakis' stuff on this. Thank you for the super chat, Dave. But I am. But obviously Michael Albert, who's been on the show before, and he talked about some of his ideas about this. David Schweikart, he has that book After Capitalism. I'm always recommending. Stuff's out there, but I think that's something that we need to do more of and do a better job of popularizing. Now,
capitalist realism, I think, is the one that I always kind of go to as the underline of is there any alternative?
And Fisher isn't really sketching out, that alternative in detail. God, it's a great book, but
no, but he's talking about escaping the matrix that makes it hard to envision that as a future. You know what I mean? Just the feelings that get us into that state where we can't even envision something.
I think Fisher is very good at diagnosing the problem with it, right? What I would also say is I think that you need to actually do some recipe writing as part of the solution here.
He's kind of saying somebody's got to have a recipe out there, but
yeah, exactly. So look, the main problem with what he's saying, and this is not at all unique to Glenn. I think there are, unfortunately, it's a widespread delusion, and in fact, it's a delusion that lots of people who even have different ideas about what to do about it still have the same problem, which is this belief that right-wing economic populism is a real thing, which just is not. That at least if we're talking about the United States, I think maybe if you get into talking about some developing countries, some sort of ex-Soviet kleptocracies with very weak local ruling classes, then I think there's a little bit more room to maneuver for people on the right to actually do things that run counter to the interests of those local capitalists. I don't want to exaggerate that point either, but I mean, I think it's probably more true there than it is, sure as hell more true there than it is here or Canada or the UK or any society like that. But certainly restricting ourselves to the United States, it's just total bullshit. None of these people actually are interested in doing anything to sand off the rough edges of neoliberalism. And that example, and again, there are people who believe that who believe that right-wing economic populist is genuine, who also think that right-wing economic populists are fascists and that we should be terrified of them. And, but they'll say things like, oh, see, even the right agrees with a lot of your economic stuff, that's something you see too. But that's also wrong, right? It's wrong no matter who says it and where they put it, the pluses and minuses. Yeah. It's just not true, right? So sure, Tucker Carlson might have scored some points by criticizing New York for rolling out the red carpet for Amazon, but just what concretely is is anybody proposing to do to make the lives better for Amazon workers, to make it easier for them to join a union, to force Jeff Bezos to pay them more money, to get them, better health care. What is anybody suggesting to do for that Tucker Carlson supports? Nothing. Like Steve Bannon, I always, forgive me if people have heard me bring this up before, but I mean, I really, like, it always amazes me thinking about this. Like, Steve Bannon had this debate that he did 2019, I want to say, with David Frum at the Monk debates in Toronto. It's like a real, like, serious, highfalutin kind of debate thing. And in that, right, like, the entire thing was just Bannon using sort of vaguely populist sounding rhetoric about, working class deplorables, and Froome using a bunch of rhetoric kind of insinuating that Bannon was a fascist. But the thing that always amazed me about it is they never actually got around to talking about any policy. And then I thought about it later. I was like, well, of course they did. They're both fucking Republicans. They probably agree on like 99% of this stuff.
Yeah.
And actually, that's why I agree with what Michael said at the time, that like, it's good that Bannon was on Red Scare, because at least the Red Scare girls asked him, hey, if you're such a populist, why don't you support Medicare for all? And then he just kind of flailed around and he didn't have a good answer to it. Like, if you look at the fine print, like, Bannon's so-called economic populism, and honestly, this bothers me much more than calling it, than on the assumption that there is real right-wing economic populism, this issue of, okay, whether you want to call that socialism or not, like, obviously I think that's ridiculous for all the reasons we were talking about, but like, I'm much more bothered by the claim that there is real right-wing economic populism, which there just is not. That, like, Bannon's populism, right? Like, what he wanted, if Bannon had gotten 100% of his way in the Trump administration, what he was talking about was like raising the top marginal tax rate up to like, pretty close to what it was in the Clinton administration in the 90s, and like using some of that for infrastructure. That's fucking it. He doesn't support Medicare for all. He doesn't support, like, he certainly doesn't support free college. He doesn't support, universal daycare. He doesn't support changing the laws to make it easier to join unions. He doesn't support any of that. Like, it's the whole thing. The whole thing is just nonsense. And like, again, I'm not even saying any of this. Say like I've got any sort of narrative about how, Glenn Greenwald is becoming a right winger or something. Like, people have been saying that for years. He never changes any of his actual positions. I don't think that, right? Like, and as far, I disagree with him about this, but like I always have. Like back in like 2011 when I was reading Glenn's stuff all the time at Salon. I think that was still Salon, not the Guardian. 2011. He had, like, I remember every once in a while he'd say something in a column like, oh, the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street are, that there's like this commonality, because of like anti-establishment stuff about, corporations and the state being in bed together, even if they understand it differently or something like that. And I thought that was a mistake then, right? I think this is a mistake now. I think that this idea that there's some sort of like big realignment, in partisan terms on economic issues, is just false, right? Like it's not again, the point is not to demonize Glenn for thinking something that I think is false. It's just that, like, as a matter of fact, I think Glenn's great, but what he's saying here is wrong, and I think it's important to understand why it's wrong and to be able to explain why it's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
and a lot of people have that definition, or that believe the class, like the realignment like philosophy. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of what the whole idea of the post left is. I mean, like, this idea that we've kind of transcended right and left politics, and we're kind of in an age of like workers' populism, which has, like, even if you were to concede that right-wing populism exists, like, let's say, you know what I mean, like, it still wouldn't bring us anywhere near what we want to do as like a project.
No, absolutely not. So I I think just to round off the segment, we have a clip from last year. There was a debate between Glenn and Nathan Robinson on this exact subject. Now, I think that for all the reasons I've been talking about, right? Like I am much closer to Nathan's side of that argument. About whether there is meaningful right-wing economic populism. But I think that Michael makes a lot of really good points in this clip, and the way he's talking about it is exactly the way that we should talk about these issues.
Well, actually, I mean, okay. One more thing on Glenn. Again, Glenn is attacked constantly by people who you're going to need to reveal a Lava Jato and a Snowden in order to approach the contribution he's been on. Okay, I have nothing but respect for Glenn Greenwald, and I also, in that same interview, he called Tucker Carlson's response to the BLM uprising grotesque, and I think he is very consistent in a view that he has of inside-outside politics. That's not our view. We have a view about capital versus labor. And that is a big, substantive difference. And I think it's actually even reflected in some of the conversations, the great conversations. I mean, Glenn broke the Lula story. I cannot emphasize how big a contribution that is. But he still, I could look at the whole Lula story through the lens of basically top-down class politics. And I wasn't interested in any corruption narrative, right? And I'm not making a question of who's right or who's wrong, but that's a fundamentally different way of looking at politics. Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of things get conflated under that umbrella with left-wing politics. But if you have a serious material class dimension that anchors labor, ironically, for all of the dumb accusations of class reductionism or whatever, it does basically eliminate right-wing populism, because right-wing populism posits all sorts of imagined national communities and various other fantasies and does not have a labor analysis.
Yeah, I mean there we go, right? Like that I think that, and that's even like that last part. Yeah, so there's the part of that we didn't watch just now. It's okay, but he does introduce Michael style some complications into the whole how to think about whether there actually is such a beast as right-wing populism question, and he makes some good points there too.
Yeah, well, it's a half hour long.
Obviously, we're going to watch the half hour. But I think that last point was the key one, right? That even much more meaningful right-wing economic populism of the kind that probably can't exist in a country like the United States, where the local capitalist class is incredibly powerful and has really deep roots, and so you don't have this sort of. You don't have right-wing figures having this kind of like being able to sort of do the Viktor Orban thing and have like room to maneuver as like these Bonapartist kinds of figures who can like exercise a lot of independent power. So I think that, again, even if it did exist in the way that it probably can't exist here, because the only possible basis the only possible basis for a successful left project is an organized working class, and there's just and there's just no equivalent. This was something I was talking about with Crystal Ball about when she was on the show the first time, that there's just no obviously, if a bunch of people who sincerely held really deep and really good left-wing views were elected to every office, there would still be this problem of how to overcome, the inevitable resistance from capital to enacting its agenda. A really militant, organized labor movement could fill that role. There's nothing equivalent that could fill that role on the populist right. So I think that the distinction he makes at the end of the clip is exactly right, and even the best forms of right-wing populism lack that, right? And I'll just say before we switch gears, somebody in the chat, there's should you go easy, on Glenn, and that's not the point, right? Like, I think one last, without making this a TMDS clip show, we're not going to play any more clips, but they have. But I think when Michael was interviewing Adolf Reed last year, maybe 2019, I think last year, but when that happened, Reed had a really good line at the end that I think applies here, where it just says this is just too Protestant a way of thinking about politics. It's all like trying to figure out who's going to heaven and who's going to hell.
Yeah.
And I'm not, obviously there are people that I like and there are people I don't like, but, I'm not primarily interested in trying to figure out, whether, even if I believed that these destinations existed, I'm not primarily interested in whether Glenn Greenwald is going to heaven, right? Like I'm interested in breaking down like what he's getting right and what he's getting wrong and responding to the substance of what he's saying, not trying to peer into his soul and make a moral inventory.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, I look at kind of some of the great whistleblower publishers in history, I guess, and there's been a lot of them. You know what I mean? Like publishers that are willing to bend over backwards, or journalists that are willing to bend over backwards and put themselves in danger. I don't think I'd want to know every single one of their thoughts, every single beef that they got into in like the 1800s or 1900s. You know what I mean? Like every single opinion they had, and kind of Twitter puts us in this place where you kind of see way too much of somebody rather than just kind of hearing these or reading these heroic stories as they happen. And I think that there's a lot of that with Glenn Greenwald, because there's a lot of like, filler with anybody. You know what I mean? Like filler tweets or like little beefs or petty squabbles that he gets into, or like even stuff like even interviews like this. And, I'm personally, I'm not too concerned with that, except to do something like this.
Yeah. I mean, if the actual content of it involves something that like is a ideological claim that's important, can like talk about the claim and evaluate it, and that's a useful exercise, trying to try to sort out on some sort of minute by minute basis exactly how you feel about somebody, I think is something we could do a lot less of. I want to just bring this up.
Something that we shouldn't have to.
Yeah. So, absolutely. So, and look, it's like there was this thing that happened over the weekend with Matt Brunig, where he had he tweeted out this right wing meme. I don't think we have the image, but it's like, I think it's supposed to be like Xi Jinping like sprinkling COVID on the world. Obviously, anybody who has like 2 minutes acquaintance with anything that Matt Brunig thinks doesn't think he was tweeting that out because he like made it or because he agreed with it.
Yeah.
He was using Twitter in a slightly retro way, which is to say that that the sort of social norms of it now are you can't tweet something like that without making it explicit that you're tweeting it to make fun of it.
It's kind of like a constant job interview or like something like that. You know what I mean? Like the way that you have to think about Twitter almost if you're like in any kind of politics or media or anything like that. Like you have to always be I mean, like you can post obviously like shit posting, but like it has to be in a context that nobody can like possibly misconstrue. Yeah.
I mean, it's the Peter Coffin had a good line about how it's like the Panopticon is an app. That's the giant surveillance thing that Foucault talks about. So anyway, enough of that.